Greetings from New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary to Central Florida Christian Academy. Many thanks to Dr. Hal Stewart for inviting me to speak to you about African American Christians. My name is Rex Butler and I teach church history. For the past few years, it has become clear to me that the American church is largely unaware of significant African American Christians who've made noteworthy contributions to God's kingdom. And so today and for the next 3 weeks, I will highlight just a few African American Christians that I think you should know about. First, to set the context, I want to provide a brief historical background to slavery in America. The first African slaves arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. Slavery became the backbone of the American economy, but it was a moral contradiction for a republic that loved freedom. At first, there were barriers to evangelism among the African slaves. Prejudice and injustice among the colonists limited evangelism, and then slaves associated Christianity with their captors. But eventually, the evangelistic fervor of the Great Awakening broke out throughout the colonies, leading to conversions among the African slaves. Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, and Gilbert Tennant all reported awakenings among multitudes of African Americans. Methodists and Baptists emphasized religion as a spiritual and emotional experience, which came to characterize African American Christianity. By 1800, slaves and free Africans were about 1/4 of the membership of Methodist and Baptist churches. Today I want to tell you the story about early Black Baptist churches and pastors in America. In 1773, the earliest known church of black members with a black pastor emerged at Silver Bluff, South Carolina. This church was organized by an itinerant white Baptist preacher known as Brother Palmer. Brother Palmer received permission from a slave owner, George Galpin, to preach to his slaves. Among his first converts were David George, David's wife, Jesse Peter, and 5 other slaves. These 8 new Christians formed the nucleus of Silver Bluff Church. Upon Palmer's recommendation, David George became the first pastor, and under his ministry, the church increased to 30 or more members. The American Revolution brought disruption to the Silver Bluff Church. The British occupied nearby Savannah, Georgia, so the slave owner, George Galpin, fled, and his slaves, including the new Christians, took refuge behind British lines. Then American forces reclaimed Savannah, and because of David George's loyalty to Britain, he immigrated to Canada in 1782, and there he became a pioneer of Baptist work in the Maritime provinces. In Nova Scotia, he became a famous preacher, delivering emotional and inspirational sermons. In 1787, Great Britain established Sierra Leone as a refuge for former slaves in Africa. So, in 1792, George led a group of Baptists from Nova Scotia to settle in this new colony. The church that he founded there is the oldest Baptist church on the African continent. David George and his wife Phyllis had 10 children. He was a pastor, church planter, and missionary. Let's return now to Savannah, Georgia, and the small, still ongoing African Baptist congregation. Now the church is under the leadership of David George's friend, George Liele. Liele was born a slave to a white Baptist deacon. Liele was saved as a youth, so his owner freed him so that he could preach. In 1775, George Liele became the first ordained African-American Baptist preacher. He was successful as a preacher to both whites and blacks, and he formed the first African Baptist church near Savannah, Georgia. When heirs of his former master attempted to re-enslave him, Liele sought protection from the British. But by 1782, the British were no longer able to protect black loyalists. So Liele left Georgia for Jamaica with his wife Hannah and their 4 children. He preached in a number of locales, including the racetrack, until he founded the Ethiopian Baptist Church near Kingston, Jamaica. George Liele's mission to Jamaica preceded the mission work of William Carey by 10 years, Adoniram Judson by 32 years, and William Knibb by 42 years. George Liele was a preacher, pastor, church planter, and a missionary. Once more, we'll return our attention to the American South to check on the progress of this early African American Baptist church. This time I want to introduce you to Andrew Bryan. He was born to slaves on a plantation near Charleston, South Carolina. His owner, Jonathan Bryan, was a Christian man who preached the gospel to gatherings of slaves. He invited George Liele to preach among his slaves. Andrew Bryan and his wife Hannah were converted and baptized by George Liele just before Liele left America for Jamaica. Soon afterward, Jonathan Bryan permitted Andrew and other black Baptists to build a shack on his property in Yamacraw, on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia. This house of worship served the small congregation that gathered around Andrew. Many whites in the South opposed meetings of blacks, even for worship, for fear of insurrections. So several times Andrew and his brother Samson, who was a deacon in the church, were arrested, imprisoned, and beaten. Records show that these brothers were severely whipped, their backs torn, until the blood ran down to the earth. But they lifted up their hands, cried unto the Lord, and rejoiced to be whipped and to suffer for the sake of Jesus Christ. It sounds a lot like the book of Acts, doesn't it? Jonathan Bryan interceded for Andrew and Samson, and they were allowed to return to their congregation. The judge of the case allowed liberty for Andrew to preach and conduct worship, but only between sunrise and sunset. The church then began meeting in Jonathan Bryan's barn in Brampton, Georgia. The church grew rapidly from a few dozen to 700. In 1788, the good work of Andrew with his congregation led to its certification as a Baptist church and to his ordination to the ministry. In 1794, Bryan raised enough money to erect a church building in Savannah, calling it the Bryan Street African Baptist Church. Then in 1800, the congregation merged with the first black Baptist church of Savannah. The growth of the church was such that 2 years later, the second black Baptist church was organized. Soon the churches were conducting Sunday schools and also providing education for black children in Savannah. Andrew Bryan died in 1812. He was a preacher, pastor, evangelist, church planter, and educator. Today it has been my privilege to introduce you to three early African American Baptists: David George, George Lyle, and Andrew Bryan. All three were born into slavery, not only political, but spiritual bondage. They were set free from slavery to sin, and along the way, they received freedom from slavery to men. Through God's grace, they became preachers, pastors, church planters, missionaries, and educators. They deserve our respect as models of Christian faith and service. Thank you for your attention to their stories.